The fires burned high on the hillside, orange against the blackening skies. Below, in the valley where the village lay, every hearth had been extinguished. Every door stood open. The cattle lowed in their pens, restless, sensing something the living could not yet name. It was the last night of October, and the veil between worlds had grown thin as cobweb, thin as breath. In the stone circle at the summit, the druids moved in silence. Their robes swept the frost-bitten grass. Their voices rose and fell in languages older than Rome, older than memory. They carried no iron. They touched no metal forged by human hands. Around them the people gathered, farmers and warriors, mothers and children, all waiting for the moment when the sun would die and the dead would walk. The wind changed. From the west, from the dark forest where no path led, came the sound of something moving, not footsteps, not wind, something else. The druids raised their hands, the people fell silent, and in that silence, in that space between the living world and the other, the festival of Samhain began. The year was dying. The harvest was gathered, and across the Celtic lands, from Ireland to Gaul, from Scotland to the shores of ancient Britain, the longest night was beginning, a night when the dead returned, when spirits walked freely, and when the future could be glimpsed in flame and shadow. This was not celebration. This was survival. This was the moment when humanity acknowledged what it feared most, that death was not an ending, but a threshold. And on this night, that threshold stood open. Chapter 1. The Veil Grows Thin. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small around you. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour the clock shows in your corner of the world, know that you are safe here. The past cannot reach forward. It can only whisper. And tonight, we listen to those whispers from a time long before our own, when the world was darker, stranger, and infinitely more dangerous. Before we begin our journey into the shadows of ancient Samhain, please subscribe to this channel if you find comfort in these old stories. Now, let us drift backward in time, past the centuries, past the monuments of civilization, to a world lit only by fire and governed by forces we have long forgotten. Let us go to the Celtic lands, to the end of October, to the night when the dead walked among the living. The Celts did not think of time as the modern world does. They did not measure their days in neat progressions of hours, nor their years in simple cycles of seasons that repeated without meaning. Time for the ancient peoples of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and the territories that would one day be called Britain and Gaul was something alive. It breathed. It moved in spirals. It had rhythm and pulse, expansion and contraction, light and dark. The year was not a circle but a living creature, and like all living things, it died and was reborn. At the heart of this understanding lay a truth that the Celts accepted without question. Death was not an ending. It was a crossing, a threshold, a doorway that swung both ways. The living world and the otherworld existed side by side, separated by a boundary as real as any river or mountain range, yet far more permeable. Most of the times, this boundary held firm. The dead remained with the dead. The living remained with the living. But there were moments, specific, dangerous moments, when the boundary grew thin, when the veil between worlds became as fragile as morning mist. And on those nights, anything could pass through. The night of October 31st was the thinnest night of all. The Celts called it Samhain, pronounced sow-in, and it marked the end of one year and the beginning of another. It was not simply a festival or a celebration. It was a cosmic event, a moment of profound spiritual danger when the natural order itself became unstable. On this night, the sun's power was at its weakest. Darkness dominated the world. The harvest was gathered or lost. The livestock were brought down from the high pastures. The cold months stretched ahead like a vast uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, in that darkness, the door to the other world stood open. The otherworld was not like the Christian heaven or hell that would come later. It was not a place of reward or punishment. It was simply the realm of the dead, the realm of spirits, the realm of the Aussie, the fairy folk, the ancient gods diminished but not destroyed, beings of power and caprice who existed outside human time. The otherworld was neither good nor evil. It simply was. It lay beneath the earth in great hollow hills. It existed across the western sea where the sun died each evening. It occupied the same space as the living world, but on a different plane of existence, visible only at certain times, in certain lights, to certain eyes. The Celts believed that on Samhain night the geography of reality shifted. The hollow hills opened. The lakes and rivers became portals, the stone circles and ancient burial mounds became doorways, and through these openings came the dead, not as ghosts in the later sense, not as pale, transparent phantoms, but as solid, present, hungry beings who remembered their lives and sought connection with those they had left behind. They came looking for warmth, for food, for the comfort of familiar places. They came to their old homes, to their old fields, to the villages where they had lived and worked and loved and died. But not all who crossed over were benevolent. Not all the dead returned with gentle intentions. Some came in anger, some came in hunger, some had died badly, violently, suddenly, without proper burial or ritual, and their spirits were troubled, dangerous, unpredictable, and beyond the human dead, there were older things. The Aussie themselves might emerge on Samhain night, beings of impossible beauty and terrible power, who took offence easily, and whose favour or wrath could determine whether a family survived the winter or perished in it. To encounter the fairy folk was to risk being taken to their realm, never to return, or to be struck with madness, or to be cursed with wasting illness that no herb could cure. The Celts prepared for Samhain as one prepares for a siege. It was not a night for celebration in the modern sense. It was a night for protection, for ritual, for careful observance of every tradition that had been passed down through generations. Every action had meaning. Every gesture was deliberate. The festival lasted 3 days. The day before, the day itself, and the day after. And the night of October 31st was the epicenter. The moment of greatest danger and greatest power. During these 3 days, the normal rules of existence were suspended. Kings could not wage war, debts could not be collected, no work could be done. The entire society stopped and turned its attention to the spirit world, because to ignore Samhain was to court disaster. The preparation began weeks in advance. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, as the leaves turned from green to gold to brown and fell like rain from the branches, the people knew what was coming. They harvested the last of their crops with increasing urgency. They slaughtered the cattle and pigs they could not feed through winter, salting and smoking the meat for the dark months ahead. They brought their flocks down from the high summer pastures to the sheltered valleys. They repaired their homes, stuffing moss and clay into every gap in the walls because the winter cold was coming, and with it something far more dangerous than weather. The elderly told stories to the young. They spoke of Samhain's past, of encounters with spirits, of family members who had returned for one night to sit by the fire, of neighbours who had violated the sacred customs and paid terrible prices. They spoke of the Lord of the Dead, the dark god who ruled the otherworld, and of his wild hunt that rode across the sky on Samhain night, snatching up any unfortunate soul who happened to be abroad after darkness fell. They spoke of changelings, fairy children left in place of stolen human babies. They spoke of curses and blessings, of bargains made and bargains broken, of the absolute necessity of respect, of reverence, of fear. Fear was not weakness in the Celtic world. Fear was wisdom. Fear was survival. To fear the spirits was to acknowledge their power. To fear the other world was to respect the natural order. The Celts did not pretend to master nature or to stand apart from it. They knew themselves to be part of a vast web of forces, most of which they could neither understand nor control. Their religion, if such a word can even apply to their complex system of beliefs and practices, was not about salvation or transcendence. It was about negotiation, about balance, about giving offerings so that offerings would be given in return, about maintaining harmony between the living and the dead, between the human world and the spirit realm, between the light half of the year and the dark. As October drew toward its close, the tension in Celtic communities became palpable. The work was done or it was not. The harvest was sufficient or it was not. The stores of food would last until spring or they would not. And on the night of the 31st, all of that became secondary to a more immediate concern: surviving the return of the dead. The people did not sleep soundly in the nights leading up to Samhain. They heard noises in the darkness. They saw movements at the edges of firelight. They felt the presence of watching eyes. The animals grew nervous, refusing to enter certain places, starting at shadows, whimpering without cause. The very air seemed to thicken, to press down, to carry whispers that could not quite be understood. And then, finally, the day arrived, the last day of October, the day when the old year died and the new year waited to be born, the day when the living and the dead would share the same earth, the same fires, the same darkness. The day of Samhain. Chapter 2. The Wheel of the Year. The Celtic year turned like a great wheel, divided not into 4 seasons but into 2 halves, the light and the dark. This was no arbitrary division. It reflected the fundamental reality of life in the northern reaches of Europe, where the difference between summer and winter was not merely a matter of temperature, but of survival itself. In summer, the world was abundant. The sun rose early and set late. The earth provided. Cattle grew fat on green pastures. Crops pushed up from the soil. Life was possible. In winter, the world contracted into cold and darkness. The sun barely cleared the horizon. The earth froze solid. Nothing grew. The stored harvest had to sustain the community for 6 months or more, and if it ran out, people died. There was no alternative. There was no rescue. Winter was a test that not everyone passed. The light half of the year began at Bedtime on the 1st of May, when the cattle were driven to their summer pastures and fires were lit on every hilltop to honour the sun's return. The dark half began at Samhain, on the 1st of November, when the cattle were brought back down and the herds were culled for winter. These were not merely seasonal festivals, they were cosmic pivot points, moments when the fundamental character of existence changed. At Bedtime, life ascended. At Samhain, life descended. At Bedtime, the world opened. At Samhain, the world closed. The Celts celebrated 4 great fire festivals throughout the year: Samhain, Imbolc in February, Bedtime in May, and Lugnasad in August, each marking a crucial moment in the agricultural and pastoral calendar. But Samhain stood apart. It was the most important, the most dangerous, the most sacred. Samhain meant summer's end. The name itself was a statement of fact, a recognition that the warm, living, growing time was finished, and the cold, dead sleeping time had begun. For agricultural peoples living close to the northern limits of cultivation, this transition was existential. Everything they had worked for during the light half of the year, every field planted, every crop tended, every animal raised, came down to this moment. Was the harvest sufficient? Was there enough grain stored to make bread through the winter? Was there enough hay to keep some breeding stock alive? Was there enough salted meat to prevent starvation when the snow lay deep and nothing could be hunted or gathered? The answers to these questions were often uncertain. Celtic agriculture was precarious at best. There were no reserves, no warehouses full of surplus grain, no elaborate trade networks to bring food from distant places. Each community lived or died by its own production. A wet summer could rot the grain in the field. An early frost could destroy the harvest overnight. Disease could sweep through the cattle. Raiders could burn the stores. The margin between sufficiency and starvation was razor thin, and every family knew it. Every person had seen winters when the food ran out before spring. Every village had graves of children and elderly who had not survived the hungry months. Samhain was the moment of reckoning. The harvest was in or it was not. The livestock were culled and the strongest animals selected for breeding stock. The rest were slaughtered because there was no way to feed them through winter. Nothing could be wasted. Every part of every animal had to be preserved. Blood was made into sausage. Intestines became casings. Bones were saved for tools and broth. Hides were tanned for leather. The work was hard, bloody, necessary labour that every member of the community participated in, from the smallest child to the oldest grandmother. This was not cruelty. This was survival. The slaughter before Samhain gave the festival its other character. It was a time of abundance in the midst of scarcity. For a few days there was fresh meat, there was blood, there was fat. The community feasted not in joy, but in grim awareness that this might be the last time until spring that anyone ate their fill. The feast was both celebration and farewell, both gratitude and mourning. They thanked the animals for their lives, they thanked the earth for its gifts, and they prepared for the long darkness ahead. But the agricultural calendar was not the only reason Samhain held such power. The festival existed at the intersection of practical necessity and cosmic belief. Yes, it marked the end of harvest, but it also marked the moment when the year itself died and was reborn. In Celtic cosmology, time was not linear. It did not march forward in a straight line from past to present to future. Instead, it spiraled. It repeated. It cycled through patterns that had no beginning and no end. The year died at Samhain and was reborn at Samhain not as the same year, but as a new iteration of an eternal pattern. And in that moment of transition, in that space between death and rebirth, chaos reigned. The Celts believed that Samhain existed outside of time. It was neither part of the old year nor part of the new. It was a liminal space, a threshold, a moment when all boundaries dissolved. The boundary between life and death. The boundary between human and spirit. The boundary between order and chaos. On this night, anything was possible. The future could be glimpsed, the past could return, the present became unstable. Normal rules did not apply, normal protections did not hold. To live through Samhain was to pass through a kind of death and emerge on the other side changed, renewed, but not unmarked. The fire festivals of the Celtic year were all linked to agriculture, but they also corresponded to stages of life. Imbolc in February, when the first lambs were born and the first signs of spring appeared, was associated with purification and new beginnings. Beltane in May, when the cattle went to pasture and young people went to the woods, was associated with fertility, growth, and union. Lugnasad in August, when the first harvest was gathered, was associated with maturity, skill, and the first fruits of labour. And Samhain, when the year died and the dead returned, was associated with endings, with ancestors, with memory, with the inevitable decline that came to all living things. This was not pessimism, it was realism. The Celts did not fear death the way later Christian cultures would. They did not see it as punishment or as separation from the divine. Death was simply the next phase of existence, as natural as birth, as inevitable as winter. What they feared was not death itself, but the manner of death, and even more, the possibility of being forgotten after death. To die and be remembered was to achieve a kind of immortality. To die and be forgotten was to truly cease to exist. This is why ancestor veneration was so central to Celtic religion. The dead were not gone. They were still present, still part of the community, still watching, still caring about the fortunes of their descendants. And at Samhain, they returned to make that presence known. The agricultural work of late October, the final harvests, the slaughtering, the preserving, was performed with one eye always on the approaching festival. Every task had ritual significance. When the last sheaf of grain was cut, it was not simply bundled and stored. It was woven into a corn dolly, a figure representing the spirit of the grain, and kept in a place of honour until spring, when it would be returned to the fields to ensure fertility for the next planting. When cattle were slaughtered, portions were set aside as offerings. When meat was preserved, prayers were spoken over the salt and smoke. Nothing was merely practical, everything was sacred. As the days shortened, the preparation intensified. Homes were cleaned thoroughly, not simply for hygiene, but to make them acceptable to visiting spirits. Special foods were prepared: bread, ale, milk, butter, meat, not only for the living, but for the dead. Wood was gathered in vast quantities, because the sacred fires of Samhain would burn for 3 days and 3 nights without ceasing. And as the light drained from the world, as October 31st approached, the people gathered in their communities and waited for darkness to fall. The wheel of the year was turning, the light was failing, the dark half was beginning, and with it came Samhain, the festival of the dead, the moment when all that had been hidden throughout the year emerged into the open, visible, and terrible and demanding acknowledgement. The harvest was finished, the judgment was rendered, and now the only question was whether the people had done enough planting, enough tending, enough honouring of the old ways to survive what was coming. Chapter 3, Till the Druids' Fire. In the Celtic world, there existed a class of men who stood between the human and the divine, between the living and the dead, between the known and the unknowable. They were called druids, and their power was absolute. They were not priests in the sense that later religions would understand the term. They were judges, teachers, astronomers, physicians, poets, historians and magicians. They memorized the laws of their people, thousands of verses preserved in memory because the druids did not write. They studied the movements of stars and planets, tracking celestial patterns across decades. They knew the properties of every plant, every stone, every element. They performed surgeries. They cast prophecies. They mediated disputes between kings. And on Samhain night, they became the masters of fire and darkness, the only humans with the knowledge and authority to navigate the moment when the veil between worlds grew thin. The training of a druid took 20 years. 20 years of memorization, study, ritual practice, and initiation into mysteries that were never written down and never spoken outside the order. A young person, usually a boy, though occasionally a girl, would be taken from their family and given into the care of an older druid. They would live apart from normal society in sacred groves, in isolated monasteries, in places where the boundary between worlds was already thin. They would learn in darkness, because darkness taught what light could not. They would learn in silence, because silence revealed what noise obscured. They would learn to endure cold, hunger, discomfort, fear, because a druid could not afford weakness. The spirits did not respect weakness. The gods did not tolerate it. By the time a druid completed their training, they had become something other than fully human. They moved between worlds with a facility that ordinary people could not comprehend. They saw what others could not see. They heard what others could not hear. They understood the language of birds, the significance of cloud formations, the messages written in the organs of sacrificed animals. They could curse and they could bless, and both were equally feared. Kings did not make war without consulting their druids. Communities did not move without druidic approval. And at the Great Fire festivals, especially at Samhain, the druids performed rituals so ancient and powerful that even they did not fully understand their origins, only that they must be performed. Exactly as they had been performed for centuries, or disaster would follow. The central ritual of Samhain was the rekindling of fire. Fire was life. Fire was protection. Fire kept the darkness at bay and the cold from penetrating human bones. But fire was also dangerous. It consumed. It destroyed. It had to be controlled, respected, approached with proper reverence. Throughout the year, every home in a Celtic community maintained its own hearth fire, kept burning continuously, never allowed to die. To let the hearth fire go out was a sign of terrible misfortune, a suggestion that the life force of the household had failed. But at Samhain, this rule was suspended. At Samhain, every fire was extinguished. The process began at sunset on the eve of Samhain. As darkness gathered, people moved through their homes, putting out every flame. The hearth fires that had burned continuously for a year or more were smothered. The torches were extinguished. The lamps were emptied. Every source of light and heat was eliminated until the entire community sat in complete darkness. This was not simply symbolic. It was terrifying. In a world without electric light, without matches, without any way to produce fire easily, to be without flame was to be utterly vulnerable. The darkness was total. The cold began immediately, and in that darkness, that cold, that vulnerability, the people waited. On the hilltops above the villages, in the ancient sacred sites, stone circles, burial mounds, places where the ancestors had worshipped for generations, the druids prepared the new fire. They did not use flint and steel. They did not use any method that involved metal. Because metal was the substance of the human world, the material of tools and weapons, and the sacred fire could not be contaminated by human artifice. Instead, they used the old method, the method from before metalworking, from before agriculture, from a time so distant that no one remembered its beginning. They used wood and friction. 2 pieces of oak were selected with enormous care. Oak was the most sacred tree, the tree of strength and endurance, the tree that survived lightning strikes and grew for centuries. The wood had to be perfectly dry, perfectly shaped, perfectly prepared. One piece was laid flat, the other was spun against it using a bow drill or fire plough, creating friction that generated heat. The process was exhausting. It required skill, strength, patience, and absolute concentration. The druids worked in teams, spelling each other as muscles tired, maintaining the rhythm, the pressure, the precise angle necessary to coax heat from wood. Around them, the community watched in silence. They dared not speak. They dared not interfere. The creation of the new fire was the most sacred act of the year, and it had to be done correctly. Eventually, if the druids had prepared properly, if they had spoken the right words and made the right offerings, if the gods were willing, smoke would begin to rise from the friction point. The smoke would thicken, the wood would begin to char. And then, impassibly, miraculously, a small orange ember would appear. The druids would transfer this ember to a nest of tinder, dry grass, birch bark, shavings of pitch-rich pine, and blow gently, steadily, coaxing the ember to grow. The tinder would begin to smoke, then to glow, then suddenly to burst into flame. The new fire was born. The moment the flame appeared, a roar would go up from the watching crowd. Not a cheer, but something deeper, more primal, relief, gratitude, awe. The fire was reborn. The year was reborn. The connection between the human world and the divine had been renewed. The druids would quickly build up the flame, adding larger sticks, then branches, then logs, until a great bonfire blazed on the hilltop, visible for miles around. And this fire, this sacred fire created without metal, born of wood and will and ritual knowledge, would become the source for every fire in the community for the coming year. But the ritual was not finished. The druids tended 2 fires, not 1. On the hilltop, they built 2 massive bonfires, positioning them so that a narrow passage existed between them. The fires burned so hot that the air above them shimmered and roared. The heat was intense enough to singe skin from several feet away, and through this passage, the community would drive their cattle. Every animal had to pass between the fires. The passage was purification. It was protection. The heat and smoke would burn away any sickness, any curse, any malevolent influence that might have attached to the beast during the year. The cattle bellowed and struggled, terrified of the flames, but the people forced them through because this ritual could mean the difference between survival and starvation. If the cattle sickened during winter, if disease swept through the herd, the community would have no breeding stock for spring. The fires of Samhain were not decoration, they were defense. Once the cattle had passed through, the people themselves approached the fires. They did not pass between them, that was only for the livestock, but they stood as close as they could bear, letting the heat wash over them, letting the smoke sting their eyes and coat their lungs. Fire purified, fire practiced, to carry the mark of the sacred fire, to settle of its smoke, to have its heat still radiating from skin and clothing, was to be wrapped in a shield that spirits would recognize and perhaps respect. Then came the most important part of the ritual. The druids took torches, unlit torches brought from the villages below, and kindled them in the sacred fire. These torches would be carried down from the hilltop in procession, moving through the darkness like a river of stars. The people followed the druids down the hillside, singing, chanting, praying, their faces illuminated by the torchlight, their shadows dancing huge and distorted against the ground. And when they reached the villages, the first homes, the waiting hearths, the druids would give each household fire from the sacred flame. One by one, the hearth fires were rekindled. The torches touched dry kindling and new flames sprang to life. Warmth returned to the homes. Light pushed back the darkness. The people gathered around their reborn fires and felt for a moment safe. Every fear in the community now came from the same source. Every flame was connected to the sacred fire on the hilltop. Every household was bound together by this common thread of light and heat that had been created without metal, without human technology, by the druids who stood between worlds. But the night was far from over. The fires burned. Yes. The homes were no longer dark, but Samhain had only just begun, and the dead were already walking. Chapter 4. The Feast of the Dead. The fires burned in every hearth, but the doors remained open. This was the custom. This was the law older than any king. On Samhain night, no door could be barred. No threshold could be sealed. The dead were coming home, and they must be welcomed. To refuse them entry was to invite disaster. Crop failure, cattle sickness, death in childbirth, madness, any of the 1,000 calamities that could destroy a family or a community. The dead had rights, they had needs, and on this one night of the year the living owed them hospitality. Inside the homes, preparations had been underway since morning. The floors were swept clean, the walls were scrubbed, every surface was made spotless, because the dead were particular about cleanliness, and a slovenly household might offend them. Fresh rushes were laid on the floor, the best linens were brought out, the table was set with care, and not just for the living members of the family. Extra places were laid, extra cups were filled, extra chairs were positioned at the table, and these chairs remained empty, waiting. The feast itself was elaborate by the standards of people who lived on the edge of subsistence. There was meat, fresh killed beef or pork from the slaughter that had taken place in the days before Samhain. There was bread made from the new grain, the first flour ground from the harvest. There was butter, pale yellow and rich, kept cool in crocks. There was milk still warm from the evening milking. There was ale, dark and strong. Brewed weeks earlier in preparation for this night, there were oat cakes, apples from the late harvest, nuts gathered from the forest, honey taken from hives before the bees went dormant for winter. It was a feast that represented months of labour, months of careful husbanding of resources, and it was set out not merely to feed the living but to honour the dead. The family gathered as darkness fell completely. They did not gather in joy. There was no laughter, no casual conversation. This was a solemn occasion, weighted with significance that everyone understood. The patriarch or matriarch of the family would speak first, invoking the names of the dead. Not all the dead, that would take hours, but the recent dead, those who had died within the past year, and the important dead, the grandparents and great-grandparents whose lives had shaped the family's fortune. Each name was spoken clearly, with respect, with an invitation implicit in the speaking. Come home, come to the fire, come to the table. You're remembered, you're honoured, you're welcome here. The living members of the family would then sit, but they would not begin eating immediately. They waited, they listened. The house creaked in the wind, the fire popped and hissed. Outside, in the darkness beyond the open door, there were sounds that might have been wind through branches, or might have been something else. Footsteps, breathing, the rustle of clothing. The boundary between imagination and reality became permeable. A shadow might move in the corner of vision. A cold draught might touch the back of the neck, despite the fire's heat. The sense of presence, of being watched, of sharing the space with something unseen, was overwhelming. Then finally, the eldest would lift their cup and pour a small amount of ale onto the floor, a libation for the dead. Others would follow, pouring milk or ale or water, the liquid disappearing into the rushes, into the earth below. Food was placed in the empty seats. Bread was broken and left on the waiting plates. Meat was cut and offered to the air. These were not symbolic gestures. The people believed absolutely that their dead relatives were present, that they were consuming the essence of the food even as the physical substance remained visible. The dead ate differently than the living. They took the life force, the nourishment, the meaning of the food, chemis, leaving behind only the material form. The meal proceeded in near silence. The living ate carefully, mindfully, aware that they were not alone. Children who might normally squirm and chatter sat still and quiet, their eyes wide, sensing the strangeness of the occasion, even if they did not fully understand it. The adults ate slowly, pausing between bites, listening. Some claimed they could hear voices in the crackle of the fire, words in a language just beyond comprehension, messages from the dead trying to communicate across the veil. Some claimed they could smell the presence of deceased relatives, a grandmother's herb-scented clothing, a father's pipe smoke, a child's milk-sweet breath. Whether these sensations were real or imagined made no difference. Belief and experience were the same thing. Throughout the Celtic lands, in thousands of homes, this scene repeated. In stone cottages in Ireland, where rain hammered against thatched roofs and wind screamed around corners. In wooden halls in Scotland, where the mountains loomed black against the sky, and wolves howled in the forests. In circular houses in Wales, where the sea crashed against cliffs and the mist rolled inland thick as wool. In settlements in Gaul and Britain, where Roman influence had begun to creep in, but the old ways still held power. Everywhere the Celts lived, the dead came home for Samhain, and the living welcomed them with open doors and full tables. But the feast was not only about honouring the dead, it was also about feeding them, appeasing them, ensuring that they returned to the otherworld satisfied rather than angry. A hungry ghost was a dangerous ghost. A neglected ancestor was a vengeful ancestor. The dead had long memories and considerable power. They could blight crops with a word. They could curdle milk with a glance. They could steal the breath from sleeping infants or strike strong men with wasting diseases that no healer could cure. The feast was protection as much as it was reverence. Feed them well, treat them well, and they might intercede on behalf of the family in the other world. Neglect them and suffer the consequences. Male families left food outside their doors as well as inside. They set out dishes of milk and bread on the doorstep, offerings for any wandering spirits who had no living family to welcome them home. These were the dangerous dead, those who had died far from home, those who had been murdered or had died by their own hand, those who had been buried without proper ritual. They wandered on Samhain night, searching for warmth and sustenance. And if they found none, they became angry. Better to give them something, even a small offering, than to risk their wrath. The food left outside was usually gone by morning. Animals took it, certainly, cats and dogs and wild creatures, but the people believed that the spirits took it first, consuming its essence before leaving the physical remains for lesser beings. In some regions, the custom extended beyond food. People would leave windows open, even in the cold, so that spirits could enter and leave freely. They would place chairs near the fire, angled toward the flames, inviting the dead to warm themselves. They would light candles and set them in windows, beacons to guide lost spirits home. The entire community became a kind of threshold space, neither fully of the living world nor fully of the other world, but somewhere in between, accommodating both. The feast lasted for hours. No one hurried. No one cleared the table prematurely. The empty places remained set. The food in the spirit dishes remained untouched by living hands. Eventually, when the fire had burned down to coals and exhaustion had settled over the household, the family would retire. But they did not go to sleep easily. The house remained open, the fire remained burning, and throughout the night, people would wake at odd hours, convinced they had heard footsteps, voices, the scrape of a chair being pulled up to the table. Some claimed to see figures in the firelight, translucent, wavering, but recognizable as deceased relatives. Whether these visions were hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and expectation, or whether they were genuine encounters with the dead, no one could say with certainty. The Celts made no distinction. If you saw a spirit, you saw a spirit. Reality was what you experienced. Children were told to stay in their beds no matter what they heard or saw. To wander the house on Samhain night was to risk encountering something that might not be a benevolent ancestor. Not all the dead who walked were kindly. Not all the spirits who entered through open doors were human. The Owl Sea walked abroad on this night as well, and they were capricious, unpredictable, dangerous. A child might be taken, replaced with a changeling who would waste away despite all care. An adult might be ensorcelled, led out into the darkness and lost forever. Better to stay still, stay quiet, stay in bed, and let the night pass. By dawn, the Samhain feast would be over. The food left for the dead would be disposed of carefully, buried usually, or given to animals but never eaten by humans. To consume food that had been offered to the dead was to invite their hunger into your own body, to blur the line between living and dead in dangerous ways. The empty places at the table would be cleared away, the doors would be closed, the household would return to normal, or as normal as it could be, in the strange days following Samhain, when the veil was still thin and the world still felt unstable. But for one night, for those hours between sunset and sunrise, the living and the dead had shared the same space, the same fire, the same table. The boundary had been crossed, the ancestors had been honoured, and the family had fulfilled its obligation to those who came before, ensuring that the dead would remember them kindly in the year to come. Chapter 5. Masks and Guises. As the Samhain feast convolved and full darkness settled over the land, another transformation began. Throughout the Celtic settlements, people emerged from their homes wearing shapes that were not their own. They wrapped themselves in animal skins, the hides of cattle, sheep, horses, deer, with the heads still attached, antlers or horns protruding at unnatural angles. They smeared their faces with ash and soot, obliterating their human features beneath layers of black and grey. They tied bones to their clothing so that they clattered and rattled with every movement. They moved through the darkness between houses, neither fully human nor fully animal, neither living nor dead, becoming something in between. This was not celebration. This was not entertainment. The modern mind thinks of costumes as playful, as make-believe, as temporary identities adopted for amusement. But in the ancient Celtic world, to change one's appearance on Samhain night was an act of deadly seriousness. It was survival strategy. It was protective magic. It was an attempt to confuse, to deceive, to become invisible to the malevolent forces that walked abroad when the veil was thin. The logic was elegant and terrible. If spirits could cross from the otherworld into the human realm, then the living were vulnerable. A spirit might mistake a living person for one of the dead and try to drag them back across the threshold. A malevolent entity might attach itself to a human host, causing illness, madness, or death. The Eos Sea, the fairy folk who were neither dead nor alive, but something older and stranger, might take a fancy to a beautiful child or a strong young man and steal them away to their hollow hills, leaving behind only a wasting changeling. The dangers were manifold, and they were real. At least, they were real to people who had no other explanation for sudden death, inexplicable sickness, or the way a healthy person could waste away despite all attempts to help them. Spirits and fairy folk, powerful as they were, had limitations. They could be confused. They could be tricked. They were bound by certain rules of recognition and identity. If a living person no longer looked human, if they smelled like an animal, if they rattled with bones like a corpse, then perhaps the spirits would pass them by. Perhaps they would mistake the living for one of their own kind. Perhaps they would not recognize a soul worth taking. The disguises were camouflage, a way of hiding in plain sight by adopting a form that was so obviously other that it paradoxically became invisible to supernatural scrutiny. The practice was particularly important for those who had to be outside on Samhain night. Not everyone could remain safely inside by the fire. Shepherds had to check on flocks in distant pastures. Midwives might be summoned to help with a birth that could not wait for a more auspicious night. Young people, driven by courage or foolishness or desperate need, might have to travel between settlements. And the druids, of course, had to move through the darkness, performing rituals, tending sacred fires, mediating between the human and spirit worlds. All of these people needed protection beyond what walls and doors could provide. They needed to become something other than themselves. The animal skin served multiple purposes. They disguised the human form, making the wearer appear quadrupedal in the darkness, like a confused beast rather than a person. They provided warmth on a night that was often bitterly cold. And they carried the essence of the animal, its strength, its instincts, its connection to the natural world. A person wrapped in cowhide became partially cow, grounded in the earthly realm in a way that might anchor them against being swept away to the other world. A person wearing deer skin took on some of the deer's wariness, its ability to sense danger and flee. The boundary between human and animal was not as fixed in the Celtic worldview as it would become in later Christian thought. Transformation was possible. Identity was fluid. And on Samhain night, that fluidity became a tool for survival. The ash and soot that blackened faces served a similar purpose. They obscured features, making individuals unrecognizable. If a spirit could not identify you, it could not target you. The dead returned looking for specific people, family members, enemies, those who had wronged them in life. But if everyone was rendered anonymous by darkness and ash, then perhaps individual vengeance would become impossible. The community became a mass of identical shadowy figures, indistinguishable from one another, and in that anonymity lay safety. Some people went further. They turned their clothing inside out, believing that this reversal would confuse spirits who relied on recognizing the patterns of human dress. They walked backward, retracing their steps in reverse, creating paths that led nowhere and could not be followed. They spoke in distorted voices, high-pitched or guttural, anything to avoid the sound of their natural speech. They avoided using their own names, calling each other by false names or nicknames, because names had power, and to speak a name on Samhain night was to invoke the person it belonged to, making them visible to whatever might be listening. Children were taught these practices early. A child who ran outside without disguise on Samhain night might not return. The stories were full of such warnings. A boy who scoffed at the old ways and went out in his normal clothes was found the next morning alive but changed, speaking in riddles, his mind touched by something that should not have touched it. A girl who forgot to blacken her face was pursued through the darkness by something she could not name, and though she reached home safely, she never spoke again. These were cautionary tales, but they were also believed to be true accounts, passed down through generations, proof that the protections were necessary. The guising tradition had another dimension as well. Some of the disguised figures moved through the community making noise, banging pots, rattling bones, shouting and wailing. This was not random chaos. It was apotropaic magic, the use of loud noise and aggressive behaviour to frighten away malevolent spirits. The logic was that if humans themselves became frightening, if they made enough noise and commotion, then timid or uncertain spirits might flee rather than risk confrontation. The line between scaring away evil and becoming indistinguishable from it was thin, but that was the point. On Samhain night, the living had to become as strange and threatening as the things they feared. In some communities, young men would form groups and move from house to house in their disguises. They would demand offerings, food, drink, small tokens, threatening mischief if refused. This was not extortion. It was ritual. The young men represented the spirits themselves, and by giving to them, householders were symbolically feeding the dead and the Aussie, ensuring that the real spirits would be satisfied and pass on without causing harm. The practice was formalized, expected, part of the social contract of Samhain, A household that refused would be remembered and potentially shunned, seen as violating the sacred obligations of the festival. The offerings given to these geysers were specific. Soul cakes, small round cakes made with butter, milk and spices, were common. Apples from the harvest, nuts, small cups of ale. Nothing of great value, but tokens nonetheless, acknowledgements that the ritual was being observed correctly. The geysers would accept the offerings with exaggerated bows or theatrical gestures, staying in character, never breaking the fiction that they were something other than human. They would move on to the next house, accumulating their small tributes, and by the end of the night they would have food and drink aplenty, which they would consume together in a feast of their own, celebrating survival, celebrating having passed through another Samhain without loss. But not all guising was communal or sanctioned. Some individuals disguised themselves for darker purposes. Old grudges could be settled on Samhain night with no one knowing who had struck the blow. A person could approach an enemy's house in disguise, leave a curse object on the threshold, and depart without being recognized. Theft was easier when everyone was masked. Violence could be committed with impunity. The social order that governed the rest of the year was suspended, and in that suspension lay danger. The druids and the community elders did what they could to maintain control, but Samhain night was fundamentally a time of chaos, and chaos could not be entirely contained. As the night wore on and the fires burned lower, the disguised figures gradually returned to their homes. They removed their skins and masks carefully, ritually, often burning them or burying them rather than simply discarding them, because objects that had been used on Samhain night retained power and had to be disposed of properly. They washed the ash from their faces. They turned their clothing right side out. They became human again, though perhaps not entirely. Something of the otherness lingered. Some participants reported dreams for days afterward, vivid, disturbing dreams in which they were still wearing the skins, still moving through darkness, unable to remember who they had been before the transformation. The practice of guising would survive for centuries. Long after the original religious meaning had been forgotten, it would persist through Christian conversion, through cultural upheaval, through the slow erosion of Celtic identity under Roman and Saxon and Norman rule. It would resurface in medieval Scotland as guising, in England as mumming, in Ireland as going about in disguise, and eventually in the New World, in places where Celtic immigrants brought their old customs, it would transform once more into the Halloween costume tradition. Children dressing as ghosts and monsters and going door to door for treats, unaware that they were reenacting an ancient ritual of protection, of camouflage, of becoming other in order to survive the night when the dead walked among the living. Chapter 6. Sacrifice and Appeasement. The fires on the hilltops burned through the night, tended by druids who did not sleep. The people had returned to their homes, had shared their feasts with the dead, had donned their protective disguises, but the most dangerous part of Samhain still lay ahead. The spirits were abroad, yes, and they demanded acknowledgement. But there were other powers at work on this night. Older powers that preceded human civilization. Powers that cared nothing for human needs or desires except insofar as those needs could be exploited. These were the Aos Sea, the fairy folk, the ancient gods diminished by the passage of time but not destroyed, and they required more than food and respect. They required sacrifice. The word sacrifice has become sanitized in the modern understanding, reduced to metaphor, to the idea of giving up something wanted for the sake of something needed. But in the ancient world, sacrifice was literal, physical, and often bloody. It was the act of giving value to the gods or spirits in exchange for protection, prosperity, or simply for being left alone. The principle was transactional but also mystical. The gods gave life, sunlight, rain, fertile soil, healthy livestock, successful childbirth. Therefore, life had to be given back, blood for blood, breath for breath. The universe required balance, and sacrifice was how that balance was maintained. On Samhain night, the druids made offerings on behalf of their communities. Some of these offerings were simple and bloodless. milk poured onto the earth, butter buried at crossroads, grain scattered on the wind, mead poured into sacred wells. These were gifts of sustenance, acknowledgements that the earth provided and must be honoured in return. But there were other offerings, darker offerings, about which the historical record becomes unclear, shrouded in rumour and Roman propaganda and the deliberate silence of the druids themselves, who wrote nothing down and revealed their deepest practices to no one outside their order. The Romans, who encountered Celtic religion during their conquest of Gaul and Britain, were horrified by what they claimed to witness. Roman writers, Caesar, Tacitus, Strabo, described human sacrifice in vivid, condemning detail. They wrote of massive wicker structures shaped like human figures, filled with criminals and prisoners of war, then set ablaze as offerings to Celtic gods. They wrote of drownings in sacred pools, of victims hanged in groves, of throats cut over altars so that blood could feed the earth. The Romans used these accounts to justify their conquest, painting the Celts as barbaric savages who needed Roman civilization to save them from their own darkness. But Roman sources are not reliable. They had political motivations to portray Celtic religion as monstrous. They exaggerated. They lied. They conflated different practices from different tribes and treated them as universal Celtic custom. And yet, beneath the propaganda, there is archaeological evidence that cannot be entirely dismissed. Bodies have been found in peat bogs across northern Europe, Ireland, Britain, Denmark, Germany, preserved for millennia by the anaerobic environment. Many of these bog bodies show signs of deliberate killing. Lindo Man, discovered in Cheshire, England, had been struck on the head, strangled, and had his throat cut, a triple killing that suggests ritual rather than murder or execution. Tolland Man, found in Denmark, was hanged with a leather cord still around his neck. Old Croghan Man from Ireland showed signs of torture before death. These bodies date to the Iron Age, to the time when Celtic culture dominated northern Europe, and while they do not prove that the Celts practiced human sacrifice at Samhain specifically, they suggest that sacrifice of some kind was part of their religious life. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the complexity. The Celts almost certainly practiced animal sacrifice. This is well documented and consistent with nearly every ancient religion. Cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses were slaughtered ritually, not just for food, but as offerings to gods and spirits. The method of killing mattered. The words spoken over the dying animal mattered. The disposal of the remains mattered. Nothing was casual, nothing was thoughtless. Every death was sacralized, every killing made meaningful through ritual. Whether human sacrifice occurred is harder to determine. If it did, it was likely rare, reserved for moments of extreme crisis, plague, famine, military defeat, when the normal offerings were not sufficient and the gods demanded more. Criminals condemned to death might be given to the gods rather than simply executed. Prisoners of war might be sacrificed rather than enslaved. Volunteers, rare but not unknown in ancient religions, might offer themselves as ultimate sacrifices, believing that their death would save their community. But these would have been exceptional events, not routine practices. What is certain is that Samhain involved offerings, and that some of these offerings were substantial. Cattle were slaughtered not just for the feast, but as gifts to the spirits. The best animals, the healthiest and most valuable, were sometimes selected specifically for sacrifice rather than being eaten by the community. This was a genuine sacrifice, not just the killing of an animal, but the giving up of significant wealth and food resources at the moment when winter approached and every resource would be needed. To give the best bull or the fattest cow to the spirits rather than keeping it for breeding or food was a statement of faith and fear. It meant the community believed that appeasing the powers of the otherworld was more important than immediate physical survival. The sacrifices were conducted at specific locations: hilltops where the fires burned, sacred groves where trees grew in patterns that suggested ancient planting and care, stone circles already ancient when the Celts used them, inherited from even earlier peoples and adopted as places where the veil was thin. Bogs and pools and wells, dark water that led down into the earth, into the realm below. These were liminal spaces, threshold places, where the human world and the other world touched, and it was at these boundaries that offerings had to be made. The druids performed the sacrifices according to formulas they had memorized during their decades of training. The words had to be exact, the gestures had to be precise, the timing had to align with celestial movements, the position of the moon, the visibility of certain stars. An error could invalidate the sacrifice, or worse, could anger the powers being appeased rather than pleasing them. The druids bore enormous responsibility. The survival of their communities depended on their knowledge, their accuracy, their ability to navigate the relationships between humans and the divine. The sacrificed animals were not wasted. Their meat was often consumed in ritual feasts, but only after the spirit of the animal had been offered. The hide was used, the bones were saved for tools or buried in special places. The blood, most importantly, was poured out onto the earth, into fires, into water. Blood was life made visible, and to give blood was to give life itself. The gods and spirits consumed the essence of the sacrifice, the life force, the meaning, leaving the physical remains for human use. Nothing was lost, nothing was wasted, but the most valuable part, the intangible part, was given away. Beyond the organized druidic sacrifices, individual families made their own offerings. A farmer might leave his best lamb at a crossroads, a gift to the Aussie in hopes that they would protect his remaining flock through winter. A mother might bury a treasured possession near a fairy mound, pleading for the health of a sick child. A fisherman might sink a valuable tool in the lake before winter froze the water, an offering to the spirits that lived in the depths. These personal sacrifices were acts of desperation and hope, attempts to negotiate directly with powers that were capricious at best and cruel at worst. The Aussie were not like gods. Gods might be swayed by prayer, by devotion, by the right offerings, but the fairy folk were more like forces of nature. Storms, floods, droughts. You could try to appease them, but you could not control them. They might accept your offering and grant protection, or they might accept your offering and grant nothing, or they might take offence at some perceived slight and curse you despite your generosity. There was no guarantee, no contract that bound them. This made the offerings to the Aussie simultaneously essential and terrifying. To give was necessary, but to give was also to invite attention, and their attention was dangerous. The night of Samhain passed slowly for those who kept vigil. The druids at their fires, the families in their homes, the disguised figures moving through the darkness. All were waiting for dawn, for the moment when the veil would begin to thicken again, when the dead would return to the other world, when the Aussie would retreat to their hollow hills, when the danger would pass. But until that dawn came, the offerings had to be maintained, the fires had to be fed, the words had to be spoken. The boundary between existence and oblivion had to be negotiated with blood and smoke and faith. Chapter 7. Divination and Prophecy. The darkness of Samhain held more than spirits and danger. It held knowledge. The same thinning of the veil that allowed the dead to cross into the living world also allowed the living to glimpse what lay beyond the present moment. The future, normally hidden, became partially visible. The past, normally fixed, became fluid and revisitable. Time itself behaved differently on Samhain night, and those brave enough or desperate enough could attempt to see what was coming. Marriage or death, prosperity or ruin, the shape of the year ahead. Divination was not entertainment. It was not parlour game or idle curiosity. In a world where survival depended on factors largely beyond human control, weather, harvest, disease, warfare, any glimpse of the future was precious. If a young woman could know whether she would marry, she could prepare herself emotionally for the spinsterhood, or begin gathering resources for a household. If a farmer could know whether his crops would thrive, he could decide how much seed to save, how many animals to keep, whether to take risks or play safe. If a community could know whether war was coming, they could strengthen defences, stockpile food, prepare for siege. The future was not abstract, it was immediate, practical, desperately important. The Celts believed that certain moments in the year were more conducive to divination than others, and Samhain was the most powerful. The logic was straightforward. Time was circular, not linear. The end of one year and the beginning of the next existed in the same eternal moment, and at that moment, past and future touched. The boundary that normally separated what had been from what would be dissolved, just as the boundary between living and dead dissolved. A skilled diviner, or even an ordinary person using the right methods, could stand in that dissolving boundary and see through it. The druids, of course, were the masters of prophecy. They studied the movements of celestial bodies across years and decades, tracking patterns that allowed them to predict eclipses, solstices, the return of comets. They read omens in the flight of birds, the direction, the species, the sound of their calls. They examined the organs of sacrificed animals, interpreting the colour and texture of liver, lungs and heart as messages from the gods. They cast sticks or stones marked with Ogham, the Celtic alphabet, and read meaning in the patterns they formed. They entered trance states through meditation, through fasting, through the consumption of sacred plants, and in those altered states they claimed to see visions of what was to come. But divination on Samhain night was not restricted to the druid class. Ordinary people, especially young people, practiced their own methods of glimpsing the future, methods passed down through families and communities, methods that required no special training, only courage and careful adherence to ritual procedure. These folk divinations focused primarily on matters of love and death, the two great uncertainties of human existence. Would I marry? Whom would I marry? Would I survive the coming year? These were the questions that haunted young hearts, and Samhain offered a chance, however risky, to learn the answers. One common method involved water. A young woman would fill a basin with water drawn from a sacred well or a stream that flowed between two properties. A liminal water, neither entirely of one place nor another. She would do this in darkness, in silhouettes, speaking to no one on the journey to the water source and back. She would place the basin in a room lit only by a single candle and would gaze into the water's surface, allowing her vision to soften and blur. If she was fortunate or cursed, she might see a face form in the water, the face of her future husband. If she saw a skull or a shrouded figure, it meant death before marriage. If she saw nothing, it meant another year of waiting, another year of uncertainty. The ritual required absolute silence. To seek was to break the spell. To laugh or cry out in fear was to invalidate the vision. Many young women could not complete the ritual. The darkness was too oppressive, the silence too heavy, the sense of being watched too intense, and sometimes what appeared in the water was not reassuring. More than one young woman fled from her divination in terror, refusing to speak of what she had seen, carrying the knowledge or the fear of it through the rest of her life. Another method involved mirrors, which the Celts obtained through trade with Roman territories and which quickly acquired magical significance. A mirror was a threshold object, a surface that showed reality reversed, a window into a world that looked like this one, but was not quite the same. On Samhain night, a person could stand before a mirror in a dark room holding a candle, and look not at their own reflection but past it, through it, into the mirror's depth. If the veil was thin enough, if the ritual was performed correctly, they might see not themselves but someone else, a future spouse, a dead relative with a message, a vision of their own death. The mirror divinations were considered particularly dangerous because mirrors could trap spirits, and a spirit trapped in a mirror might escape into the living world through the person who had imprisoned it. Apples featured prominently in Samhain divination. Apples were sacred fruit associated with the other world, with the gods, with knowledge and temptation. On Samhain night, apples became tools for seeing the future. A young person might peel an apple in a single continuous strip, then throw the peel over their left shoulder. The shape the peel made when it landed would form a letter, the first initial of their future spouse's name. Or they might float apples in a barrel of water and try to catch one using only their mouth. No hands allowed. The first person to succeed would be the first to marry. These practices seem playful to modern sensibilities, but they were performed with absolute seriousness, with genuine belief that the results were meaningful. Fire divination was older and darker. A person would stare into the flames of the Samhain bonfire till their vision blurred and images began to form in the dancing light. The flames would take shapes, human figures, animals, objects. A skilled diviner could interpret these shapes as messages about the future. A figure that appeared to be walking away meant departure or death. A figure facing toward the viewer meant arrival of a stranger. Animals in the flames indicated the nature of the coming year. Cattle for prosperity, wolves for danger, birds for messages or journeys. But staring into fire was dangerous. The flames were hypnotic. They could induce trance states from which some people did not fully return. There were stories of individuals who stared too long into the Samhain fires and afterwards seemed changed, distant, as if part of them had remained in the flames. Nuts were also used for divination, particularly hazelnuts, which grew in groves that were considered sacred. A young couple, or two people considering marriage, would each place a hazelnut in the fire's edge. If the nuts roasted quietly side by side, the relationship would be peaceful and lasting. If they popped and jumped apart, the relationship would be stormy or short-lived. If one nut exploded while the other remained intact, one partner would die before the other. The simplicity of the ritual belied its emotional weight. People made serious life decisions based on the behavior of nuts in fire, because they believed absolutely that the fire was revealing truth, that chance was not random but meaningful, that the gods or spirits or the universe itself was communicating through these small signs. Dreams on Samhain night were considered prophetic. The boundary between waking and sleeping was yet another threshold, and on this night, when all thresholds were permeable, dreams became windows into what would be. People prepared for prophetic dreaming by following specific rituals. They would eat a particular meal before bed. Salted herring was common. The salt and fish both having associations with preservation and the sea, with past and future. They would place certain objects under their pillow. A piece of wedding cake, a stone from a churchyard, a sprig of rowan. They would speak incantations before sleep, inviting true dreams, requesting guidance from ancestors or gods. And then they would sleep if they could sleep on this most uncanny of nights, and wait to see what visions came. The dreams that came on Samhain were often disturbing. People dreamed of their own deaths in vivid detail. They dreamed of battles not yet fought, of disasters not yet occurred. They dreamed of the faces of strangers who would become important in their lives. They dreamed of the dead who sometimes had messages and sometimes only wanted to be remembered. Not all Samhain dreams were prophetic. The mind, stretched by ritual and expectation and fear, created its own visions. But some dreams proved accurate. Some people dreamed of events that later occurred exactly as seen. And so the tradition persisted, generation after generation, young people courting prophetic dreams on Samhain night, despite the nightmares that often resulted. The druids warned against too much divination. They taught that knowing the future was dangerous, that some knowledge was meant to remain hidden. A person who knew the day of their death might waste their life in fear, or might become reckless, believing themselves invulnerable until that fated day. A person who knew they would never marry might give up on life, might fail to form other meaningful connections. The future was mutable, influenced by choices and actions. To know it too clearly was to risk becoming trapped by it, to forfeit free will to fate. Better, perhaps, to face the future in ignorance, responding to each day as it came rather than living always in anticipation of what was seen on Samhain night. But humans are curious creatures, and the desire to know, to see beyond the present moment, was stronger than the warnings. Every Samhain, people attempted divination. Every Samhain, some succeeded in seeing something, whether true vision or convincing illusion. And every Samhain, the future became a little less mysterious, a little more tangible, as if the act of looking forward brought what was distant closer, made what was possible inevitable. As dawn approached, the divinations concluded. The basins of water were emptied, the mirrors were covered, the fires burned down to embers. And people tried to sleep, to rest, carrying with them whatever knowledge they had gained, or thought they had gained, whatever comfort or terror the glimpse of the future had provided. The veil would thicken again with daylight. The otherworld would recede, and life would continue, informed now by what had been seen in the darkness of Samhain, for better or for worse. Chapter 8. The Roman Shadow. The world was changing. The Celts, who had dominated Central and Western Europe for centuries, who had sacked Rome itself in 390 BC, who had spread their culture from Ireland to Turkey, found themselves facing an enemy they could not defeat through strength of arms alone. The Romans came not just with legions, but with roads, with cities, with a different understanding of time and space than the divine. They came with writing, with bureaucracy, with a hunger to conquer not just land, but culture itself. And when they encountered Samhain, they did not simply destroy it. They began, slowly and methodically, to transform it. Julius Caesar invaded Gaul in 58 BC. By 51 BC, the Celtic tribes of modern France and Belgium were under Roman control. Britain followed, invaded in 43 AD under Emperor Claudius, though the conquest was never complete. Scotland remained free and Ireland was never invaded at all. But where Roman power reached, Roman culture followed, and with it came Roman religion, Roman festivals, Roman ways of marking time and honouring the dead. The Celts did not simply surrender their beliefs, but neither could they resist the overwhelming pressure of empire. What emerged was a hybrid, a blending, a slow erosion of the old ways as they were absorbed into the new. The Romans had their own festivals of the dead. In February they celebrated Feralia, a day when families visited the tombs of their ancestors, left offerings of grain and salt and wine, and performed rituals to appease the spirits of the deceased. The tone was sombre, respectful, formal. The dead were honoured, but kept at a distance, safely in their tombs, not walking among the living. In late October they celebrated a festival for Pomona, the goddess of fruit and orchards, marking the final harvest of apples and nuts. This was a celebration of abundance, of gratitude for the earth's gifts, without the darker elements of death and otherworld that characterised Samhain. When Roman administrators encountered Samhain, they saw elements that seemed familiar, a harvest festival, acknowledgement of the dead, but wrapped in practices they found barbaric or incomprehensible. The druids in particular troubled the Romans. These priests who wielded such power over their people, who could command kings, who performed rituals in secret groves, who refused to write down their knowledge, represented everything Rome found threatening about Celtic culture. The druids could not be controlled through the usual Roman methods of co-optation and incorporation. They could not be bribed with citizenship or positions in the colonial administration. They remained stubbornly other, stubbornly resistant. Rome responded with systematic suppression. Druidic practices were outlawed, sacred groves were cut down. The great oak forests where druids had trained for generations were cleared for farmland or fuel. Druids themselves were hunted, imprisoned, executed. The persecution was neither complete nor entirely successful. Druidism survived in Ireland, which Rome never conquered, and in isolated pockets of Britain and Gaul, where Roman control was weak. But the heart of the Druidic tradition was broken. The 20-year training programs ended. The vast stores of memorized knowledge began to be lost. The intricate rituals were simplified or forgotten, and with the Druids' decline, Samhain began to change. In Romanized Celtic territories, Samhain persisted, but took on new characteristics. The formal Roman festivals of Feralia and Pomona blended with the older Celtic practices. The focus shifted slightly. The wild, dangerous aspects of Samhain, the walking dead, the open doorways to the other world, the sacrifice and divination, were softened. The festival became more about remembering the dead than about fearing them, more about harvest thanksgiving than about survival through winter. The timing shifted slightly as well, aligning with Roman calendars rather than Celtic lunar calculations. The 3-day festival compressed into a single day, or expanded into a longer but less intense period. But beneath the Roman overlay, the old practices continued. People still left doors open on the night of October 31st, still set places at the table for dead relatives, still wore disguises to protect themselves from spirits. The bonfire still burned, though now they might be officially dedicated to Roman gods rather than Celtic ones. The divination rituals still occurred, though participants might be more circumspect, more careful not to attract the attention of Roman authorities who viewed such practices as superstition at best and dangerous magic at worst. The Celtic language itself came under pressure. Latin became the language of administration, of trade, of education. To succeed in the Roman world, one needed to speak Latin. Celtic languages survived in rural areas, in households, in the intimate spaces where Rome's reach was limited. But Latin words began to creep into Celtic speech. Latin concepts began to reshape Celtic thought, and gradually, over generations, the very structures of Celtic understanding, their way of marking time, their relationship with the divine, their sense of identity, began to erode. Intermarriage between Celts and Romans blurred cultural boundaries. Children of such unions grew up in households where both traditions were present, and they synthesized rather than chose. A child might learn Roman history from their father and Celtic songs from their mother. They might sacrifice to Roman gods in public and Celtic gods in private. They might celebrate Samhain but also Feria, seeing no contradiction in honouring the dead through multiple traditions. These hybrid generations carried both cultures forward but transformed each in the process. The Roman influence was not entirely destructive. Roman technology improved Celtic agriculture. Better ploughs, better irrigation, better crop rotation meant more reliable harvests, which reduced the existential terror that had characterized Celtic winters. When starvation was less likely, when survival was less uncertain, some of the desperate intensity of Samhain naturally diminished. The festival remained important, but it was no longer a matter of life and death in quite the same way. The dead still deserved honour, but perhaps they were no longer quite so frightening. The otherworld still existed, but perhaps it was a bit further away, a bit less likely to intrude catastrophically into daily life. Roman roads connected Celtic territories in new ways. Information travelled faster. Ideas spread more easily. A practice that had been local to one valley might now spread across a province within a generation. But this same connectivity also meant that distinctive regional variations began to homogenize, that the rich diversity of Celtic culture began to flatten into something more uniform, more Roman, less uniquely itself. The price of prosperity and peace was identity. By the 4th century AD, the Roman Empire was transforming again. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, had become the official religion. The old Roman gods, Jupiter, Mars, Pomona, were being abandoned by the very people who had once imposed them on conquered territories. And this new religion, Christianity, had its own ideas about death, about the afterlife, about how the living should relate to the dead. It had no room for the Celtic otherworld, for the Aosi, for the permeable boundaries that made Samhain meaningful. Christianity taught that the dead went to one of 3 places, heaven, hell, or purgatory, and that they did not walk the earth, did not return home, did not require feeding or appeasement. The dead were either saved or damned, and either way they were gone. This teaching struck at the heart of Samhain. If the dead did not return, then why leave doors open? If there was no other world adjacent to the living world, then why wear disguises? If the only spirits abroad were demons, then why make offerings that might attract them? Christianity did not accommodate Samhain. It sought to replace it entirely. But the people, especially in rural areas far from centres of Roman power and Christian authority, were not ready to abandon practices that had sustained their ancestors for centuries. They would not give up Samhain without resistance. They would not forget the dead without being divorced. And so began a long, slow conflict between Christianity and the remnants of Celtic paganism, a conflict that would take centuries to resolve and would never be entirely complete. The Roman shadow had fallen across Samhain, changing it, weakening it, but not destroying it. That final transformation, that ultimate absorption and remaking, would require not just Roman law but Christian theology, not just military conquest but spiritual conquest. And that conquest was only beginning. Chapter 9, the Church's long hand. The Christianization of Europe was not an event but a process, slow and uneven, advancing and retreating like a tide that took centuries to fully come in. In some places, conversion happened quickly, imposed by royal decree or accomplished through the dramatic baptism of a king and his court. In other places, especially in rural areas where Celtic traditions ran deepest, Christianity arrived late and made accommodation with existing practices rather than replacing them entirely. The Church was pragmatic. It learned through trial and error that people would not abandon their ancestral festivals simply because they were commanded to do so, but they might transfer their loyalty to new festivals that occupied the same calendar dates, that served similar emotional needs, that allowed continuity even as the theology changed. Pope Gregory III, in the year 835 AD, made a decision that would profoundly affect the future of Samhain. He moved the feast of All Saints' Day from May the 13th to November 1st. All Saints' Day, also called All Hallows' Day, was a Christian festival honouring the saints and martyrs, the holy dead whose intercession Christians sought. The official reason for the date change was practical. May 13th coincided with the dedication of a chapel in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, but November 1st was less crowded in the liturgical calendar. But there was another reason, one that church documents do not explicitly state but that historians have come to recognise. November 1st was the day after Samhain. November 1st was when the Celtic New Year began. By placing a major Christian festival on this date, the Church could offer Christians, especially newly converted Celts, an alternative to their pagan traditions. They could honour their dead, but in a Christian way, through prayers to saints rather than offerings to ancestors, through liturgy rather than divination, through the safety of church walls rather than the danger of open doors and hilltop fires. The policy did not originate with Pope Gregory III. It came from an earlier pope, Gregory I, who in the 6th century had written explicit instructions to missionaries working among pagan peoples. Do not destroy their temples, he advised. Purify them and rededicate them to Christian saints. Do not forbid their festivals, transform them. Let them continue to feast and celebrate on their traditional days, but redirect the celebration toward Christian purposes. The people will be more easily converted if they do not feel that they are losing everything they once held dear. Give them continuity. Give them familiarity. Give them a bridge from the old ways to the new. This strategy, called syncretism, was deployed throughout Christian Europe. Pagan wells became holy wells dedicated to saints. Stone circles became sites of Christian pilgrimage. Gods became saints, their feast days preserved, but their identities altered. Brigid, the Celtic goddess of fire and poetry, became Saint Brigid of Kildare, her February festival absorbed into the Christian calendar. The winter solstice celebrations became Christmas. The spring fertility festivals became Easter. And Samhain, the great festival of the dead, became All Hallows' Day, with the night before becoming All Hallows' Eve, which would eventually compress into one word, Halloween. The Church added another festival the following day, November 2nd, called All Souls' Day. If All Saints' Day honoured the holy dead, the martyrs and saints who were certainly in heaven, All Souls' Day was for everyone else, the ordinary dead, family members and ancestors who were in purgatory, working off their sins, hoping for the prayers of the living to speed their journey to heaven. On All Souls' Day, families would visit cemeteries. clean the graves of their loved ones, leave flowers, say prayers, and sometimes leave food offerings. The practice was not so different from the Samhain feast. The setting of places for the dead, the offerings left for returning spirits, but the theology had changed. The dead were not present at the meal. They were in purgatory, benefiting from the prayers but not walking the earth. The boundary between living and dead was firmly closed. Throughout the medieval period, from roughly 500 AD to 1500 AD, Samhain and All Hallows continued to coexist in an uneasy blending. In Ireland, which had never been conquered by Rome, and which converted to Christianity relatively peacefully through the work of missionaries like St. Patrick, the old and new traditions intertwined more than they conflicted. People went to church on November the 1st and honoured the Christian saints, but they also lit bonfires that night, left food for the Aussee, told stories of the old gods who had become the fairy folk. The church officially disapproved, but local priests often participated, or at least tolerated these practices, recognising that faith was stronger when it allowed some flexibility, some room for cultural identity to persist alongside religious doctrine. In Scotland, the blending produced unique traditions. The practice of guising, dressing in costume and going from house to house, continued, but now the guisers performed songs, poems, or short plays in exchange for food, rather than simply demanding offerings. The performances often had Christian themes, stories of saints or of biblical events, but the structure was pure Samhain, pure Celtic tradition of marking the thin veil between worlds through disguise and ritual movement through the community. Similarly, the turnip lanterns carved with grotesque faces and lit with candles were said to represent Christian souls in purgatory, but they served the same function as ancient protective charms, frightening away malevolent spirits. In England and Wales, the traditions evolved differently as Saxon and Norman invasions brought new cultural influences. The All Souls' Day practice of souling emerged. Poor people, often children, would go door to door singing and praying for the dead in exchange for soul cakes, small pastries made specially for the occasion. This was presented as Christian charity, a way for wealthy households to accumulate spiritual merit by feeding the poor while the poor helped pray for the donor's deceased relatives. But the practice bore obvious resemblance to the old Samhain customs of geezers demanding offerings, of feeding spirits to ensure protection. The form was Christian, but the structure was Celtic. The church attempted, with varying success, to suppress certain aspects of Samhain that could not be Christianized. Divination, especially, was problematic. The church taught that attempting to see the future was sinful, that it showed lack of faith in God's providence, and that it potentially involved traffic with demons. Parish priests preached against divination. Church courts prosecuted those caught practicing it, but the practice continued, especially among young women desperate to know whom they would marry, especially in rural areas where the church's authority was weak. The methods became slightly more Christianized. One might pray to St. Andrew or St. Agnes for a vision of one's future spouse, but the underlying impulse remained the same. The bonfires persisted as well, though their meaning shifted. They were no longer explicitly sacred fires tended by druids and used to rekindle every hearth. But communities still built large fires on the night of October 31st or November 1st, and people still gathered around them, still drove cattle near them for protection, still carried torches lit from the communal fire back to their homes. The church eventually accepted this practice, blessing the fires, claiming them as Christian celebrations of light overcoming darkness, good overcoming evil. The pagan origin was not forgotten, but it was buried under layers of Christian interpretation. By the time of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, the relationship between the church and the remnants of Samhain varied greatly across Europe. In Catholic countries, All Saints and All Souls' Days remained major festivals, with elaborate church services, processions, and cemetery visits. The folk customs associated with these days, the bonfires, the costumes, the divinations, were tolerated as harmless traditions, local colour that did not threaten core Christian doctrine. But in Protestant regions, especially in areas influenced by Calvinism, the attitude hardened. Protestant reformers rejected the Catholic concept of purgatory, which meant All Souls' Day made no theological sense. They rejected prayers to saints, which meant All Saints' Day lost its significance. And they rejected what they saw as Catholic superstition, the lingering pagan elements that had been absorbed rather than eliminated. In Scotland, the Kirk, the Presbyterian Church, actively suppressed Halloween traditions. Ministers preached against them. Church sessions, local religious courts disciplined those courts celebrating. The bonfires were banned. The guising was forbidden. For a time, it seemed Halloween might disappear entirely from Scottish culture. But traditions that are rooted in centuries do not die easily. They went underground. They persisted in secret. They were kept alive by grandmothers telling stories to grandchildren, by communities in remote valleys where the Kirk's authority barely reached, by the stubborn human need to mark the turning of the year and to remember the dead. And then, in the 19th century, these survivors of ancient Samhain would cross the ocean to the New World, carried by immigrants fleeing poverty and famine, and there they would be reborn in a new form, transformed yet again, but still recognizable, still carrying the DNA of that ancient Celtic festival when the dead walked among the living and fire kept the darkness at bay. Chapter 10. Echoes in the Dark. The ships left from Liverpool, from Glasgow, from Cork and Belfast. They carried human cargo packed into steerage, families fleeing the Great Famine that devastated Ireland in the 1840s, Scots displaced by the Highland clearances, Welsh miners seeking better wages. All of them crossing the Atlantic in conditions that killed many before they ever saw the promised land. They brought little with them: clothes, tools, a few treasured possessions, but they brought their memories, they brought their stories, they brought their traditions, including the old customs of Samhain that had survived Roman conquest, Christian conversion, and centuries of suppression. And in America, in a land that had no ancient traditions of its own, no deep history of observing the end of October, these immigrants found space to resurrect practices that had been fading in the old country. The Irish, especially, brought Halloween to America. The word itself, Halloween, was Irish, a contraction of All Hallows' Eve that had been in common use in Ireland for centuries. The practices were Irish, the carving of jack-o'-lanterns, though in America they used pumpkins instead of turnips because pumpkins were larger, easier to carve, and abundantly available. The guising tradition, though in America, it would eventually be called trick-or-treating. The belief in spirits abroad on Halloween night. The bonfires, though these were gradually abandoned as fire became dangerous in increasingly urban environments. The divination games, which became party entertainment rather than serious prophetic ritual. All of these arrived in America with the immigrants and took root in a culture that was young, flexible, willing to adopt interesting customs without worrying too much about their origins. At first, Halloween was primarily an Irish immigrant festival, celebrated in Irish neighbourhoods and viewed with suspicion by the Protestant majority, who saw it as Catholic superstition. But gradually, as Irish immigrants integrated into American society, as they moved out of ethnic enclaves and into the broader culture, Halloween spread. By the late 19th century, Halloween parties were fashionable among the middle class. Women's magazines published Halloween entertaining ideas. Schools incorporated Halloween celebrations into their calendars. The holiday was becoming American, shedding some of its Irish Catholic identity and taking on new characteristics shaped by American culture. The American Halloween emphasized fun over fear. The supernatural elements remained: ghosts, witches, skeletons, but they became decorative rather than dangerous, symbols rather than real spiritual threats. The divination games that young Irish women had performed in trembling seriousness became light-hearted party activities, ways to create excitement and laughter among guests. The costumes became more elaborate and varied, drawing not just on Celtic tradition, but on American popular culture. Characters from books, frightening figures from folklore, comical disguises. The boundary between the sacred and the secular, which had always been permeable in Halloween's history, dissolved almost entirely. Halloween became a secular holiday, divorced from All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, existing for its own sake. But beneath the commercialization and secularization, the ancient patterns persisted. Children going door to door in costumes, demanding treats under implied threat of mischief. This was the geysers of Scotland, the soul cakers of England, the Samhain tradition of feeding spirits to ensure protection. The carved pumpkins with candles inside placed in windows and on porches. These were the turnip lanterns of Ireland, meant to guide friendly spirits home and frighten away malevolent ones. The focus on death, decay, skeletons, ghosts. This was the Celtic acknowledgement that October 31st was when the veil between living and dead grew thin. The form had changed, the theology had changed, the conscious understanding had changed, but the structure, the deep grammar of the festival remained Samhain. In the 20th century, Halloween became fully commercialized. Candy companies promoted it as a day to buy sweets. Costume manufacturers created elaborate ready-made disguises. Greeting card companies produced Halloween cards. Stores decorated for Halloween weeks in advance, creating a commercial season around the holiday. Some religious groups, especially conservative Christians, began to object, seeing Halloween as pagan or satanic, creating alternative celebrations called harvest festivals or Reformation Day that occurred on October the 31st but deliberately avoided Halloween imagery and themes. The debate over whether Halloween was harmless fun or dangerous paganism mirrored debates that had occurred centuries earlier in Christian Europe. Meanwhile, in the lands where Samhain originated, the traditions had nearly died. In Ireland, Halloween had become Americanized, with trick-or-treating and plastic costumes imported from the United States, replacing older, more distinctive Irish practices. In Scotland, Halloween had been suppressed so effectively by the Kirk that entire generations grew up without celebrating it. In Wales, the traditions had blended so completely with English customs that specifically Welsh elements had largely disappeared. Ironically, the places that had preserved Samhain most faithfully were no longer in Celtic lands but in America, where immigrants had recreated their festivals away from the scrutiny of churches and governments that had spent centuries trying to eliminate them. But in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, something unexpected happened. As scholars began to research and publish the actual history of Halloween, as people became curious about the origins of the traditions they had grown up with, interest in Samhain resurged. Neo-pagan movements, especially Wicca, adopted Samhain as one of their major festivals, attempting to recreate what they believed ancient Celtic practices had been. Celtic cultural revival movements in Ireland, Scotland and Wales sought to reclaim and preserve traditions that had been nearly lost. The internet allowed people across the world to share information about traditional Halloween practices, inspiring some to return to older forms of celebration. Modern Samhain celebrations, whether by neo-pagans or by people simply interested in tradition, often include bonfires, though these are now carefully contained and regulated by fire codes. They include feasts where places are set for deceased relatives, though participants may not fully believe the dead are present. They include divination, though usually performed with an awareness that this is recreation of tradition rather than serious prophecy. They include costumes, though now understood as continuation of ancient guising rather than as modern invention. These contemporary practitioners are attempting to reach back across centuries of Christian overlay, across centuries of cultural change and suppression and forgetting, to touch something they sense was important, was meaningful, was worth preserving. The question of authenticity is complex. Modern celebrations of Samhain are not the same as ancient ones. Too much has changed, too much knowledge has been lost. The druids did not write down their practices, and what we know of them comes largely from hostile Roman sources, or from folklore collected centuries after the practices themselves had ended. Modern neo-pagans are, in some sense, inventing tradition as much as recovering it, creating rituals that feel ancient but are actually contemporary constructions based on fragmentary evidence and informed guesswork. But perhaps that has always been true. Perhaps every generation reinvents its traditions, adapts them to current needs, claims continuity with the past while actually creating something new. What is certain is that the core impulses behind Samhain remain relevant. The need to mark the changing seasons, the need to honour the dead and maintain connection with those who came before, the need to confront fear of death, of darkness, of winter, by ritualising it, by turning it into something humans can approach and master rather than simply endure, the need for community gatherings at times of transition. These are human needs that transcend any particular culture or era. The Celts felt them, medieval Christians felt them, modern people feel them, and so the festival persists, in whatever form, under whatever name, serving those eternal human needs. On October 31st, as darkness falls, children still dress in costumes and go from house to house. Pumpkins still glow from windows. Bonfires still burn in places where they are permitted. People still tell ghost stories, still think about the dead, still feel the particular atmosphere of this night that is different from all other nights. Most who participate do not know that they are reenacting rituals that are thousands of years old. Most do not know about the Celts or the druids or the Aussie or the thin veil between worlds. Most think they are simply having fun, celebrating a secular holiday that belongs to no religion and offends no one. But the knowledge is there, available to those who seek it. The history is recoverable, at least in outline, and sometimes, on Halloween night, when the wind blows cold and the darkness seems deeper than usual, when shadows move in unexpected ways and the sense of presence becomes almost tangible, people feel something old, something that predates Christianity, predates Rome, predates written history. They feel the echo of Samhain, that ancient festival when the dead walked among the living, when fire kept chaos at bay, when humans acknowledged their place in a universe they could not control but could only honour and fear and attempt to appease. The candles burn low, the fires fade to embers, the costumes are put away, and the night passes, as it always has, as it always will. The dead return to wherever the dead reside. The veil thickens again. The ordinary world reasserts itself, and we who remain wake to November 1st, to the beginning of winter, to the dark half of the year, carrying forward the tradition whether we understand it or not, whether we believe or not, keeping alive in however attenuated a form the memory of our ancestors who stood on hilltops in the darkness, watching fires burn, waiting for dawn, surviving another Samhain, another year, another cycle of death and rebirth in the eternal turning of the wheel. The story ends where it began, in darkness, in fear, in the space between worlds. Samhain continues, Halloween continues, the names change, the meanings change, but the night itself remains, October 31st, the moment when the year dies and is reborn, when we remember that we too will die, and perhaps be remembered, when we light fires against the dark and hope they burn until morning.